Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, broadcast Sunday mornings at 8:30, repeated again at 4:30. Of course, also at my site, The Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. You'll find all the episodes of Wichita Liberty TV there, along with show notes for each episode. So if we mention anything today, charts, figures, or whatever, I'll try to link to those on as well. With me today, Karl Peterjohn, of course, and also our special guest, Shawn Sullivan. He is Budget Director at the Kansas Division of the Budget, a position he's held since June of 2014. So, Shawn Sullivan, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Glad to be here.
So, you, the Division of the Budget is part of the executive branch, so that means you were hired by Governor Brownback, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what does the Division of the Budget do?
There's a couple of things. The first is that we work with the governor to develop his budget recommendations. So we did that. There's several statutory timelines that we follow for how the budget process flows. State agencies, whether it be universities or commerce, there's several. They begin the year in July by working on their new budget cycle for the upcoming year. They submit those to us in September. We then scrub through them between my staff and I, September, October, November, and then around late November, early December, we work with the governor and his staff to develop what his budget proposal is going to be, either revisions for the current year or what a new proposal will be for the next 2 years. We unveil that in January, and then we work between January and June to track it to the legislature, explain it to the legislature, try to maintain what our position or proposal was and advocate for it. Legislature passes it. We then work with the governor to decide, should we line item veto anything, veto the whole thing, sign it, etc. And then we start the whole thing over again in July. So that's the main thing. The second is we develop fiscal notes to determine for each piece of legislation that is introduced, how much does it cost, either for or adding costs or reducing costs or adding revenue. And then we also, third, monitor the state's cash flow situation on a daily basis to make sure we have sufficient resources to pay our bills and are moving money around as we need to. So those are really the three main things.
So we hear legislators talk a lot about fiscal notes. What role do they play in the legislative process as committee hearings go on and debate on the floor and things like that? Fairly important role.
There's, I don't even know how many, 1,000 new pieces of legislation that are introduced every session. So we develop, my staff, which I have 9 analysts, develop fiscal notes for every piece of legislation, which means that if it's a health-related bill, they work with the Department for Health and Environment or Aging and Disability Services and determine with that agency, if this legislation were to go into effect, then how much would it add to what you have to do? Would you have to hire new staff? Would there be an additional cost that would be promulgated on other units of government? That kind of thing. A lot of legislation just has zero additional cost to it. Some have significant cost. I did a fiscal note this year for a Medicaid bill that actually was not expansion, but a Medicaid process bill that would change things that would have had a $47 million additional cost to state budget. So that tends to make the ears of legislators kind of open up to that, or their eyes perk up when it has significant costs, because they know that that will then make it much more difficult for them to get that piece of legislation passed if it has a fiscal note attached to it.
And I think, isn't it by statute or custom or whatever, that if a fiscal note says $47 million, legislators can't say, well, I really think it's only going to be 25.
Right.
Let's use that instead of 47. Is that correct?
That's right. And that happens all the time. We start our fiscal notes in January and run them January, February, March, April, kind of those 4-month time period. I get stopped at the Capitol all the time saying, can you look at the fiscal note for House Bill 2155? I think that you did wrong, or it was too high for these reasons. So legislators do a lot of times think that the fiscal note was wrong because they know if it has a cost to it, that's going to be harder for them to pass the bill. But by law, whatever we assign as the additional cost has to then be added to the state budget expenditures if that piece of legislation is passed.
And Karl, I think in your former career you did something similar in California, didn't you?
In the California Department of Finance I did, and I was
For Jerry Brown?
No, well, for 2 weeks. For 2 weeks for Jerry Brown and 2 years for Ronald Reagan. But having said that, does the legislative research side of the legislature get involved in this in any way, shape, or form in terms of the discussion? And legislative post-audit, I know, does interim reports that look at numbers and costs. Right. Do they factor into your work at all, or are they completely, is any input they have separate and distinct?
Legislative research is involved. When we develop our initial fiscal note, it then goes to the legislature that requested it or that developed the legislation, or to that committee that's assigned to. When they have a hearing on a piece of legislation and they work it, if they work it, what they call working it, if there's amendments to it that would potentially increase or decrease the cost of that bill, then at that time legislative research gets involved and helps determine those adjustments on behalf of the legislature.
Okay.
Well, we've come up against our first commercial break, so let's take a moment off for a commercial break. This is Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl, Peterjohn, and Kansas Director of the Budget, Shawn Sullivan. So the Kansas state government runs on a fiscal year starting July 1st through June 30th, and we're coming up to the kind of near the end of fiscal 2017. We've got about 3.5 months left. We have to make some changes, don't we, pretty quickly to bring the budget into balance.
That's correct. We, unlike the federal government, can't print our own money. We have to have a balanced budget every year, which means we have to be essentially above zero of our general fund account. So we have 3-4 months to do that. The House has passed what's called a rescission bill, which is a revision of the current year budget. We're waiting on the Senate to do the same. The versions that we propose would have a number of proposals attached to it, including using some one-time funds to get through the end of this year to get above zero.
And then after that, we have to think about the fiscal 2018 and 2019 budgets. Before we talk about the numbers in specific, a few years ago we went to a 2-year budget cycle rather than just 1 year. Has that made much of a difference in how the legislature in your office conducts its business?
There's a couple of things. The first is the year that you're developing both years. It makes it, I think, much more intensive a process that session. 2, I think it provides more certainty for agencies and schools, which I think is a positive thing. The third thing that I think we need to think about, but hopefully we become better at, is the consensus revenue process. If we develop revenue estimates on which the budget is based on, it's much harder to get the second year of that budget cycle. So what we're doing now for fiscal year 19, which would start July 1 of 2018, it's much more difficult to develop an accurate estimate for tax collections for the second year of the budget. So we have done a number of things to try to rework that process and make it more accurate, but just inherently it makes it more difficult to develop an accurate estimate. So I think it has good and bad aspects to it, but I think the good outdoes outweigh the bad.
And I know developing those estimates, I mean, if you look at the report the estimating group comes up with, they're trying to guess what's the price of a barrel of oil going to be in 2 years. And, you know, if you knew that with much certainty, you could...
You're in the wrong occupation. You need to be in a different occupation.
Very much so.
And you would be rewarded accordingly.
Yeah. Yes. So what is some things we have to do to get the budget balanced or planned or whatever for the next couple of years?
This year, as we said, I think a lot of what will be done is one-time fixes, some capers aspect to it as well. For the year that starts July 1, the governor's proposal had a mix of things that was included in it. It had a number of what I think were very good efficiencies, particularly for schools that were attached to it, that I think when most citizens, Kansans, hear things like schools should be working on group purchasing or should consolidated health plans, most Kansans would think, yeah, that's something they should do. It had that, it had some spending reductions, it had some Medicaid proposals and efficiencies attached to it. It had some capers, reforms and lowering of contributions. It had a $180 million tax increase. It had some one-time fixes. So it had plenty for lots of people not to like about it.
Right.
But that's going to be true for about any budget proposal that's developed and talked about this year.
Are there significant savings when you talk about some of these process and procedures? Because we can say, okay, you know, run around, turn out the lights, but is there real savings there? And could you talk a little bit about that outside study? I think it's commonly called the A&M report.
The legislature asked paid an outside efficiency consultant group to come in last year called A&M, Alvarez and Marsol. They developed about 105 recommendations, I think it was, to implement. We internally within the executive branch and our 13 agencies have already implemented a number of those or are in process between now and the next 2 years. What we need help with now is for things that require statutory authority. So the things that we included in the budget for the next 2 years would require statutory authority. So things like schools doing more bulk purchasing instead of 286 different purchasing systems, or instead of 286 different benefit plans for schools, we need legislation to make that happen. Anytime you need changes like that, tends to rile the locals up. The local school boards desire local autonomy. So that's really the challenge for those things. But
has the legislation actually been introduced yet? And if so, has it had hearings?
Yeah, yes and no. There was legislation introduced that was intended to be patterned after the A&M report on the two K-12 efficiencies that we proposed, and both of those would have significant savings of $80+ million a year. But the legislation differed from us in how to implement it, but those are things that could be worked out. And yes, they have had hearings, and it was, I don't want to say, but I guess fairly predictable. In both, in the hearing that they had about group purchasing, we had a lot of school districts that showed up. Wichita 259 showed up and had testimony in opposition. And then there was myself and our Secretary of Administration that showed up testifying in support, and really hasn't gone anywhere from there.
Yeah, that anytime you mess with the small school districts, it seems like you're asking for a political hot potato. Well, let's take another commercial break. This is Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl, Peterjohn, and Kansas State Budget Director Shawn Sullivan. One of the things we hear about that people may be confused about is the general fund versus the all funds budget. General fund in the neighborhood of $6 billion, but all funds, if I remember, is about $14 billion.
$16 billion.
$16 billion. Okay, I'm a little bit out of date. What's the difference between the two, and why is there so much attention paid to general fund rather than all funds?
General fund is mainly what we have control over and what we are spending state general fund dollars on. The all funds includes a lot of federal grants, federal Medicaid money that's coming in. It includes highway funds that are non-state general fund expenditures. So it's important to pay attention to both, but you are right. The overwhelming majority of the time at the legislature and their budget committees spend on the budget is spent on the state general fund, and I think that's true probably for most states.
But Medicaid's such a big part of the financial challenge going forward, and if it's in this all funds and generally looked at elsewhere, and there's a sad and unfortunately very long history of estimates for Medicaid costs being understated, doesn't that leave you in a much more difficult situation budgetarily in terms of for both the general fund aspect of this and the all funds?
It can. But the Medicaid situation, as an example, every dollar that we spend, about 44% is spent by the state, 56% is spent by the federal government or what they give us.
So is that 44% is that the state pays, is that general fund
It is general
dollars?
fund.
And the 56% is all funds?
Correct.
Right, and so that's why there's attention on the general fund, because on that 56 cents from the federal government, you have no discretion on how that's spent. It's spent according to...
Unfortunately, a lot of Medicaid, we have very little discretion for what we pay, even on the state side.
Mm-hmm.
It's a state and federal partnership with Medicaid. Every state, it's that way. They pay for 56, 57% of it. We pay for the rest. They make the rules. We follow them. But hopefully some of that is changing.
So we pay for the rest, but people are telling us that we should let the federal government pay for the rest. In other words, we should adopt the Medicaid expansion that was part of the original Obamacare plan, and the state or the federal government will pay almost all of our Medicare. Is that right? Or Medicaid, I'm sorry.
If it's too good to be true, it probably is.
Okay.
But it is true that for Medicaid expansion, which 31 states have done, I would say we're on the right side of the 19 states that have not done it. The federal government promised to pay 100% of the cost for a couple of years, and then it ratchets it down to 90%, I think, after 5 or 7 or something like that. But
so that's the source of where people say we're giving up $1 billion.
It's free money.
Yeah.
But already that... How many $1 trillion are we in debt at the federal level?
Right.
Oh, well, on the books about 20 trillion, but if you take all liabilities, you're over 100. You're over 100 trillion, and we're only a $14 trillion economy.
There's no way they're going to be able to keep those commitments at the 90%, where they're paying for 90% and the states are paying for 10. Already in the much discussed Affordable Health Care Act, AHCA, I think it's been called this week by Speaker Ryan in the White House.
The repeal and replacement of Obamacare.
That plan, that already changes the percentage that the share between the federal and state government. So Obamacare has only been in a place for a couple of years, and it's already being talked about change. I think will change. The states will have to pick up much higher percentage of the cost, which is why I think Kansas has been smart to wait and see what would happen. And then I think why it would behoove us now to wait and see what's going to happen at the federal level with their Medicaid program before we jump off the cliff and commit ourselves to $1 billion or more.
And I think a lot of people don't realize this, because I think the do-gooders are kind of not exactly truthful, but poor children in Kansas already have health care. That's the S-CHIP program, isn't it?
That is correct.
And really poor people already have Medicaid. What we're talking about is expanding the eligibility to a class of people who are able-bodied working people, but just not making a whole lot of money. So it's, I don't want to say it's not heartless or whatever, but it's not safety net spending. We're really talking about a permanent expansion of the welfare state, I think.
It would be an expansion of the welfare state. We currently serve around 425,000 people on our Medicaid system. This is for what our population is 3 million or so, a little less than 3 million.
Just a little under 3.
That's a significant percentage of our state population is already on Medicaid. If we were to expand Medicaid, we'd be adding anywhere between 150 to 180,000 additional people. And these are what are considered able-bodied adults that currently aren't eligible for Medicaid, that would be above the current Medicaid threshold for meeting the financial eligibility. So there's been a lot of discussion back and forth about the legitimacy or the policy reasons for whether to add them or not. But if we add them, we'd have over half a billion people on our Medicaid system, which to me is
half a million additional people.
So it's
half a million total.
Oh, half a million total. So we're about 18% of the total state population.
And that is
17%.
Quite a bit. So let's take another moment off for a commercial break. This is Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, Karl Peterjohn, Kansas Budget Director Shawn Sullivan. Karl, you had a question for Shawn.
Yes, last year the legislature took some leadership and the governor signed into law, and hasn't Governor Brown back in the legislature, I don't think, got much credit for trying to reform welfare and create some savings and recreate the environment we had in the late 90s, where welfare reform was able to get people to work, help people get off the dependency train and into the workforce. Where does Kansas stand with that legislation from last year?
There's been a lot of good improvements made there. As you said, there was landmark legislation at the federal level, and the addition of work requirements for welfare in the late 90s. A lot of that kind of backslid or moved away from that since that time. At the state level, within the last year or two, there have been additional work requirements that have been added, additional job training, additional resources. I think all those things have been great, and the reason Governor Brownback really does a great job talking about this program and the reforms and the need for it, and also the need to go to the federal level. And I think it's all couched by the fact and the desire that poverty programs since the mid-60s, we've spent trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars on them, and it hasn't significantly impacted the poverty rate.
Pretty much the same.
Pretty much the same. We're giving handouts, but we're not helping with upward mobility. So the governor puts it well when he talks about this, about the need to not provide a pittance of welfare money, but to provide them with additional resources with work, job training, get them out and off welfare so they're having a better self-worth, more independence, upward mobility, more wages, those kind of things. And we have seen that work here in Kansas.
And I think that's important. Arthur Brooks, our friend, talks about people are happy when they have earned success, not just taking money charity from the government. One of the things that's happened last year was a bill to do performance-based budgeting, which is something I know that ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has found to be very effective in a few states. What is this all about, Shawn, the performance-based budgeting?
There's a couple of things, and there was a bill passed last year, and we supported that. And there's 3 phases to it, and by the time we get it all enacted and developed, it'll really be January of 2019. But we went through the first phase of it with state agencies and have that finished January 2017. And that first phase was for state agencies to work with my staff and their budget fiscal staff, their program staff, and work to develop new, what we call program inventories of every program they have within our agency. So put on paper a better reason for the program, what the statutory responsibility is it discretionary versus mandatory, try to, in a consistent manner between agencies, track all the spending, all the programs, all the overhead, all the FTE or employees, and put those in a consistent format. So seems like common sense, but not necessarily something that we've done in state government.
Are you finding things that people had forgotten about that exist that we're still spending money on?
I am just now, to be honest, starting to dig into it. We got them all in January as kind of a data dump into my agency, then we give it to the legislature, and just now here in early March have the time now to sit down and start going through it with a fine-tooth comb. But I think it will yield some good results for us, and we've done as much as we've done a lot of work over the last couple of years and cutting back the cost of kind of non-K-12 or non-school spending. I think at this point where our opportunities are to look at programs that we have and are they effective? Do they have performance metrics tied to them? If they don't, why and how can we add them? If they have performance metrics, is the program working? Should we continue the program? And to look at all those things better instead of just adding money to that program every year.
About outsourcing some of these functions, is that part of what goes into this process too?
I think it will be, yes, as we get into it more.
And I think the A&M had some recommendations with regard to outsourcing too, I believe.
They did. So a lot of the things that we do with information technology or IT, we've been trying to do ourselves. And just within the executive branch, where we have 13 agencies, historically, we have all gone and bought licenses from Microsoft. We have all bought hardware separately, software separately, bought licenses from Oracle separately. So we are now going and we are, as a first phase, negotiating. When you pool all your resources together, you're able to go to the market, leverage more volume for lower prices, and take advantage of that. We're doing that. The second thing is looking at outsourcing mainframes and outsourcing a lot of other things within the IT world that the private sector did a long time ago that we've been slow to do for whatever reason. So that will I think yield some great results here as we get more into that.
I think earlier today at the Pachyderm Club you talked about there's just tremendous resistance to changing a lot of these things, and we don't have time today to go into what all the reasons were, but it's tough to change things in government, isn't it?
We are creatures of habit, and we like things the way they've always been, and that is certainly true in state government, both for legislators and also for state staff as well.
And I think we're seeing this at the federal level with the angst over the repeal and replacement of Obamacare. Even Republicans, I think, are kind of reluctant to pull back some of the things that were given to people by our last president. So,
true.
Guys, that's it for today. So, Karl, Peterjohn, thank you very much. Shawn Sullivan, State Budget Director, thank you, and we'll see you back next week.